This time on Building the Exocet, I'm putting together the rods and pistons. Okay, so basically this is the cleaned components of the bottom end of the motor. I took really great care when I was disassembling the motor to make sure I know, since I'm not replacing bearings at the advice of my machinist, I'm making sure that every piston, I know which cylinder it was in, every rod and rod cap are stay together, and I know which cylinder those were in. I know the top bearing, the bottom bearing of every single one of these. As I was cleaning them, to make it simpler, what I did is I cleaned the rotating assembly for what I'm calling cylinder 1, cleaned those, then moved on to cylinder 2, then to cylinder 3, then to cylinder 4. I didn't just throw them all in a bucket of carb cleaner and do it all at once. So every one of these pistons, this is the stock 1997 Miata piston. They had quite a bit of carbon buildup on top of the piston, but I went through and very carefully cleaned every single one, soaked in carb cleaner for about 24 hours, dug out all the ring glands. Everything looks near new. Same thing with the rods, the bearings, everything were deep cleaned. And then I soaked them in a little bit of WD-40 real quick in a spritz just to put a little protective film on them so they would not rust before I assembled the block. So basically, before these go in the engine, they have to be assembled. You have to insert your, connect your rod and your piston. You don't necessarily have to put your bearings in, but get them ready to go in, know which way they're lined up. Now, there's a few tips on this that Mazda's made it very easy, and most engine manufacturers do. You know which way the rod and the rod cap go together, because if you look closely, there's a hash mark on each piece. When those two are put together, those line up. If they are backwards, you can easily tell because only one side will have the hash mark. As well as you know which way the rod goes into the motor because of this oil gap here. Now, also on the piston, there is markings, basically an F. What that F means is that stands for front of motor. So how I have these set up is my number 1 piston. I'm not sure if that's the actual one it's called in the motor, if that's 1 or 4, but the number 1 piston is the first piston from the front side of the motor. So basically, according to the factory service manual, this groove here for the oil means that is the front of the rod. This mark here means that is the front of the piston. So these would go in the motor like this. And that's very important because you can see here in the top, the grooves in the top of the piston, one is for the intake side, the other is for the exhaust side. So you need to make sure that they are on the right side. Otherwise, if you notice this groove on this side, let me think here, I think that's the intake side, is much deeper than the groove for the exhaust side. So putting them in backwards could cause valve clearance issues, and you could have some contact there. So now basically, just to give you a quick rundown, basically this piece here is called the piston. This is the wrist pin. This is what connects the connecting rod to the piston. These are the circlips that hold these wrist pins in. This is the rod here, and this bottom piece is the rod cap. These are the rod bearings, and these are the nuts for the rod cap. So basically, before these components go in the motor, they need to be assembled. That assembly includes putting in the piston rings properly and checking their clearance values, as well as attaching the connecting rods to the piston to ensure that they are in the correct orientation before you put them in the motor. Then once you have them all together, then basically it's just a matter of basically popping these rods and pistons into the motor in the correct direction, and then attaching them to your crankshaft. The next component I have here, and this is really the only part on the engine besides seals that I am replacing for the time being. A lot of people have been saying, why in the world wouldn't you just do new rods and pistons? You're going through all this work. The main reason is this is the first time I have rebuilt a motor, so I would rather not spend $2,000 to $3,000 on machining and performance parts just to screw it up and be out all that money. So part of why I'm doing this is to clean it, paint it, put new oil seals in to get rid of some oil leaks. The other reason being that I can kind of learn this process, see how it's done, find out if I did it right or not on really $100 of machining and, you know, I think it was $50 of rings and $100 of seals. So if something does happen, I'm not out much money, and then when something bad does happen to this motor, as it will be under boost, and if eventually I want to up the power level, I will be going to a forged rod and low compression forged piston. So that's my reason for doing this. Basically, I'm doing this as a trial run. And if everything goes good, then hopefully in the future, I will know what to do correctly. So basically, in your piston ring box, and these are Molly, basically an OEM piston. I believe they are you can see here, I believe they were a cast and chrome piston ring, but I cannot remember for sure off the top of my head here. So you basically have 3 different sets of oil rings. There's actually 5 rings. The first one, let me double check here, is the top compression ring. Then this is the wiper ring, which goes on the underneath the compression ring. And then the bottom one, and there are 2 more rings, one for the top, one for the bottom of this, are called the oil scraper rings. And so each of them must be put correctly into the piston, but also there is what's called an end gap. That's basically this uncompressed ring. You can see here when it goes in the motor, it will be compressed down. Now, this gap here, you know, if you were having this built or having this all machined, your machinist would go through and gap these. These are supposed to be pre-gapped correctly, the ends, but I'm going to double check that. But basically what you want to do is when that sits in that, I believe this is an 83 millimeter bore, and then the ring is compressed, you need to take a feeler gauge to check that end gap. So the first thing I'm going to do is check that end gap. Then once I have those, I can assemble them on the piston. But these end gaps do not all line up. There are specifications in the factory service manual for the correct orientation. You would have your oil scraper ring in a certain orientation, and your top and lower rings on your oil scraper are in a different orientation, and then the wiper ring and the compression ring sit at a different orientation as well. So there's not a straight shot through the end gaps on these rings. So next I will show you how I'm going to just quickly check my clearancing on my rings, and we'll go from there. Here's my first cylinder bore. One thing to note on these rings is they do not come cleaned from the factory. So you need to clean these before inserting them into your block and inserting them into your piston. You can even see here the oils, because basically they just have a preservative and a dust and a grime on them. That all needs to be cleaned off. Now, most all piston rings I have seen have a dot there. That dot usually always indicates up. So, for example, this is the top compression ring. The wiper ring, you will notice on that has a groove. I don't know if you can see that just right there on the edge, there is a groove. That groove is supposed to be on the bottom side. Flip it over, and we see the pin indicating up. So these 2 rings I am going to gap into the cylinder bore just to see what that end gap looks like. The factory specification that I found in the service manual was 6 to 11 thousandths of an inch. If it is any bigger than that, the ring's not correct. If it's smaller than that, the ring will need to be filed away. These are supposed to be a set of already clearanced rings that I bought, but I want to double check them before I insert them into the piston. Compression ring, we will flip it over until we see our dimple indicating this side is up, and then we are carefully going to insert this into our cylinder. Now, in order to make sure the gap is correct, it must be 90 degrees exactly in the cylinder bore. How would you do that? Piston. Placing the piston upside down, just push that right in that block till it looks lined up good. Looks perfect. Now, I will take a 6/1000 feeler gauge. It fits in. So now, I'm going to jump up to a 9/1000, and it fits. So what I've ended up finding is 15/16 is the gap. And that was worrying me because reading on the factory service manual here, it shows the standard #1 ring end gap is 6/1000 to 11/1000. However, I noticed down here maximum is 39/1000. So I am still okay, little wider, but it looks like that is going to be fine. Hopefully I'm correct on that. So now I am going to remove this piston ring from the bore, and I will be placing it with the #1 piston because I want to keep it with that piston now. Okay, so I didn't shoot any video of installing the piston rings here, as it's quite tedious work, especially when you haven't done it before. But just to show you, this is a pair of piston ring expanders. What you would do is you would insert the ring like so into the grooves, and they're basically just a pair of pliers. They open up the ring so that it can seat over the piston itself. So here I'm going to show you the correct orientation of the piston rings. I don't know if you can see it here, but in the middle, that oil scraper spacer there, that should be lined up with the wrist pin. Then the lower oil scraper ring should be 30 degrees offset here. The upper should be the opposite 30 degrees, so about 60 degrees around, offset from that. Then, let me set my piston down here. Your second ring in the middle here is set 30 degrees offset of this side of the piston. And your top, your primary compression ring here, is offset 30 degrees up from that. So basically you have a ring end gap here, 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 and here. So they are all on opposing sides of the piston itself. So that's what it should look like with the pistons installed. Now time to attach the rod. So here is the part about mounting basically your rod to your piston. We'll take the end cap off. This is the oil notch here. That should align with the marking that says front on the piston, and it should slide up in there. Now, there are two circlips that go on either end of the wrist pin to hold it in place. It is unbelievably important that this pin gets in that groove. If it does not, pin's going to move around, you're going to have some serious issues. So basically the way I've been doing it is I first get the first wrist pin somewhat inserted into that groove. Then I take a pick and basically just hold my thumb there. This is the hardest thing to do, believe it or not. It's really not easy. And try to get it started. Once you get it started enough, then you can eventually, using your thumb, it'd be nice to have about 4 hands and a few fingers here, but wait until you hear that click. When you hear that click, your circlip is now inserted. Now, once again, checking our orientation. This notch, the F, that means we are good to go. We are going to take some assembly lube. I'm using Permatex Ultra Slick for this. And we want to coat the wrist pin well with assembly lube. As there won't be any or very little oil during the initial startup, the assembly lube is going to act as the lubricant during startup. Good to keep an extra towel nearby to wipe your hands off because that stuff is extremely sticky and nasty. So here we go. This is a little tricky here as well. You want to get the wrist pin started on the back side there. And this should not go in easily. It should be a little bit of a bear. You might even need to use a hammer to start punching it through. That means that the pin is the correct size. You don't want a real loose. Mazda does not recommend having a loose wrist pin. I cannot remember what the force level, they wanted it pressed in. I did not see the need for that. If you get it in far enough, then once again checking correct orientation, notch in the rod, going toward the front, then line that up, and sorry, I know that's shaking the camera there. Then basically your goal is to get this wrist pin in far enough that you feel it contact the other circlip. Clean up some of this assembly lube here. Sorry, I hope the camera's not too shaky. I know it's on the table I'm pounding on with a hammer. It's mounted to that. And then the next hard part, and one thing I noticed, I have been saying notch here. That's incorrect. There's notches on both sides of the rod. I have them marked. I just thought it was a coincidence I marked on that side, but I have it marked for the forward-facing side of the rod here. So all my rods are marked for the cylinder that they plan on going with into, as well as this is the front direction of that rod. So excuse me, hopefully I didn't say that wrong too many times. I know I probably did. Now with this circlip, basically once again going to try to get it down in there, and then holding it in there, otherwise it will pop right out. Going to compress it until we can get most of it in. Compress it again. Now, you must make sure that this gets pushed into where you hear a click. Completed the installation of the connecting rods into the pistons. A few things I'm going to check. Not going to do any video on it, but a few things I am going to double check before I start installing the crank and get ready to insert the assembled pistons and rods into the motor. Is I'm going to double check that all my circlips have fully seated into the groove on each side of the wrist pin. I'm also going to double check my piston direction is correlating correctly with the markings that I made and the markings on the side of the rod. I didn't find anything. Basically, all my markings, as I remember, it was a couple months ago I took it apart, but all the markings I can remember, I had the marking on the rod cap, the dashes and everything were on one side, so I have that all assembled that way. I just want to double check that. Also going to check my offset of my piston rings. I will probably end up doing that right before I insert them into the piston bore, as I want to make sure the orientation is good right before they go in. By orientation, I mean where the ring end gaps are, that they are as Mazda recommends. Also going to recheck the side clearance on my piston rings. I didn't show that in the video, but basically the clearance is the amount of gap between in the ring land. When the ring is inserted, there's a small, I mean you can barely see it, small gap. The spec on it's like, I can't remember what it was, 1.5 thousandths or something like that. It's a very minor amount. It's basically the smallest measurement I have on my gauge there. Then last thing, I'm just going to double check that the rod is moving freely in the piston and everything looks good in there. And then doing a last blow off and cleaning of the rod. So that's it for this video. Next video will be installing the crankshaft and checking thrust bearing clearances and so forth. And then after that, we'll get to finally kind of getting the bottom end together. So thanks for watching. Once again, if you don't think I know what I'm doing, let me know down below. If you see a serious flaw I made, please let me know down below, because I would like to know that. And I will see you next time. Thanks, guys.